Well, hello, welcome back. This is incredibly exciting for me. Stephen Hicks has returned to the podcast once again for round 2 of what will ultimately be 3 episodes of what is becoming a great introduction to the life and work of Friedrich Nietzsche. In episode 34, a couple of months ago, Stephen and I did part 1, where we documented Nietzsche's life from birth to university, to ultimately concluding at the lowest point in Nietzsche's life, when he was in the high mountains of Sils Maria, just before he published Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In this episode, sound like a New Zealander. In this episode, we pick up exactly there and start the episode from explaining Thus Spoke Zarathustra, this allegory for becoming who you are, which is arguably Nietzsche's magnum opus, the most important book that he ever wrote. We then moved on, touched on the genealogy of morality, beyond good and evil, and Hicks gives us a comprehensive understanding of slave morality as well, the master-slave morality dynamic as well. We concluded this episode just before Nietzsche's cognitive fall, the famous horse incident in Turin, and obviously everything that comes after that, which is how his legacy might have been manipulated by his sister, how then the Nazis picked up on his work, and then how we can remember Nietzsche today. What does he mean in this modern society, which is a subject that Hicks is completely across. He wrote a book very famously now called Nietzsche and the Nazis. And so you'll see in the podcast description here that there's a link to that free audiobook that you can listen to on YouTube. I think now with Nietzsche being relatively understood, it's going to be fascinating to hear what his legacy might inform us about modernity and the modern world. Is it actually the hell that we can assume that he might have thought it was? And I'm super excited to see what Hicks has to say about that. If this is the first time you're tuning into this podcast, or the first time you've heard of Stephen Hicks, then I'll just very briefly give a couple lines of his bio. Stephen Hicks is a professor of philosophy at Rockford University, which is in Chicago, and he's also the executive director of the Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship, a senior scholar at the Atlas Society. Hicks has published 6 books. The one most relevant here is his brilliant Nietzsche and the Nazis, but he also famously published a book in 2004 called Explaining Postmodernism, which he has done a terrific job in other podcasts explaining what that means. But then also there's the book itself. Him and I have never actually spoken about that explicitly. We kind of did in episode 3. Hicks was actually the first guest who wasn't a friend of mine that came on to this podcast, and we talked a little bit about objectivism versus subjectivism, and that sort of touches on it a bit, but it was by no means a deep dive at all. But that's Stephen Hicks. This is episode 2 of 3 of Understanding Nietzsche's Life, and hopefully providing what will be a good source on the internet of getting into Nietzsche and understanding his work from a peripheral sense. Obviously, if you want to learn the specifics about any one of them, you'd have to deep dive into hundreds of hours of additional content, which you'll be able to find very readily on the internet. But then there's also, of course, the original text itself. Hang around to the end of the chat for my afterthoughts, and also where I'm going to explain what my ambition is for this podcast more generally, since I don't want to take away from the conversation by making that awkward transition now. If you're keen, hang around to the end and you'll hear what I have to say. And so, with no further ado, here is Stephen Hicks on Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, Slave Morality, and more. Well, Mr. Hicks, welcome back. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ryan, or Mr. Faulkner Hogg, if we're going to be formal.
Thank you. Well, let's pick up exactly where we left off in the last chat. So we're at a point in Nietzsche's life where his books weren't selling. He walked away from a career of certain pompous security and wealth. Women rejected him. He was getting into his 40s. He was sickly, and he was and even at his lowest, he was suicidal as well. But in the depths of his misery, thus spoke Zarathustra. And so could you please explain the meaning of this book and the significance of the parable on self-overcoming, where he introduces the Übermensch, when you contrast that to just how low he was in his life?
I suppose the quick answer to that question is no. I can't explain it in 1 hour. No, it's an extraordinarily rich work, philosophically and literarily. No, that's actually a cheap answer. We can say some of the important things about the book, but yes, as you mentioned, one of the interesting things is where Nietzsche was in his life personally. Mm-hmm. And so there always is this broader question about the relationship between philosophy and one's personal life. So abstract philosophy and autobiography. But at the same time, it's not too parochial or unique to human being, because in one sense, Nietzsche wants to argue that we all need to go on a hero's journey. And actually, the whole point of the species as a whole is a kind of hero's journey that we should be embarking upon. And just as with heroes' journeys, you have ups and downs, that you go into the bowels of hell before you emerge into the sunlight again, and hopefully find your mountain to climb, or whatever the metaphor is. But what's interesting about Zarathustra is it marks a departure for Nietzsche, because he was on a standard academic path. Obviously, as a young man, he was brilliant, well educated, reading all of the great works in philosophy, literature, history, and so on, and mastering classical languages as well. While his reputation is mostly as a philosopher, his PhD was in philology, love of languages, and particularly ancient languages. And then he was appointed to being a professor at a kind of a German, even though it was in Switzerland, it's a German-style university. And academic life is professionalizing itself in the 1800s and so on. And so, for a lot of reasons, he breaks away from that. He resigns from his position. He goes off and starts a new phase in his life, but it's a radically different style. So rather than being in the cloistered in a nice, safe academic position, and all of the formats for how you write and how you publish and so on are all worked out, he's now a free spirit, a free agent, and he's wandering around Europe and finding his voice, and out comes Zarathustra. So not only in terms of the content of Zarathustra, but also the form of Zarathustra is original for him. And one of the very interesting things about Nietzsche, or at least reactions to Nietzsche, is how difficult it is for many people to get past not only the content of Nietzsche's work, but also the form in which he presents his work. One of the occupational hazards we philosophers have, actually most smart people, is once you get used to doing philosophy a certain way, it's hard for you to recognize philosophy when it's being done a different way. And that's on top of all of the usual obstacles of, I sense that this person is taking a position or making arguments that I don't like. They're going in a direction I don't want to go, or I think is false. And so one, especially if one's second rate or third rate, is kind of looking for excuses not to have to read a person. And so you just, this person's wrong, so I don't need to read them. And Nietzsche, because of the uniqueness and iconoclastic nature of most of his work, he evokes that reaction in huge numbers of people. But then on the top of that, the form in which Zarathustra is presented as a series of parables in a somewhat literary form, with a number of kind of speeches and dialogues and so on. It's not a way of doing philosophy that is recognizable to much of academic philosophy, and it's hard work. Now, so all this is very intentional for Nietzsche, but it's another reason why people who don't like Nietzsche will dismiss him as not being really a philosopher, or just say that he's not worth our attention for various reasons. Now, we can get into the particular metaphors. There's many beautiful, inspirational lines in there. No matter what your views are, there's something in Zarathustra for you. But also, it is carefully calculated. It's not just a brilliant thinker working out and presenting a philosophy of life, but he also is doing it in a way where he's being highly attentive to rhetoric. One of the other occupational hazards philosophers have is, we're so focused on truth and clear argument and so on. So we're trying to be very rigorous, but it becomes dry and lifeless and deathly. There's this kind of funny line that says, with with analytic philosophy of a certain sort, right? Rigor comes, but also, unfortunately, mortis. Right? So you get rigor mortis, and so it's like death to read certain sorts of things. So Nietzsche is attentive to this, and he's aware that not only does he need to have a original philosophy that is well worked out and is going to be appealing to intellectually the smartest people who are willing to stick with it, but also that it needs to be inspirational, that rhetorically, right, human beings are not just desiccated premise and conclusion kinds of beings, right, that we want things to be vital, we want to be involved, we want to have a sense of purpose and meaning, and to go back to the language of hero's journey, that I am a hero or a potential hero, and I want to go on my journey. And partly what Nietzsche is presenting is a philosophical and a rhetorical journey that we can go on. So he's got a fictional character, Zarathustra. At this point, he's 40 years old when the book begins. He's been away, isolated for 10 years on his mountaintop. Prior to that, presumably, he had 30 years of living that was somewhat formative. And now he comes back, and then he encounters all sorts of bizarre characters and interesting characters and pathetic characters. And we see a great panoply of different kinds of individuals presented in literary form. And we see how they react to Zarathustra. We see how Zarathustra reacts to them. So all of the things that make literature, fiction literature, rhetorically powerful, Nietzsche is trying to incorporate them into this philosophical work. So the point is going to be then, I think, that you have to be very good, or at least willing to go on a journey to try to become very good philosophically, if you're going to get anything out of Nietzsche. But also you have to be willing to go on a literary journey, and be willing to do all of the hard work that first-rate literary interpretation takes if you are going to get something out of Nietzsche. And then another theme, we're talking about philosophy as autobiography, and we can come back to that one. How much of Nietzsche is in this, and how much he's just saying this is the human condition. But also there's this theme that Nietzsche is always insisting on, that philosophy is a do-it-yourself enterprise. That it really doesn't do you any good to just have it all laid out to you by even a smart professor who presents views clearly and objectively, but kind of just delivers everything to you on a platter, and you can just absorb it more or less passively. Nietzsche's, one of his themes is that that's not how philosophy works. You have to do it. You have to. Another kind of metaphor. He might point in a direction, but you have to travel in that direction, right? Or he might offer some signposts, but you have to read the signposts and decide which of the many possible journeys you are going to go on. And so in that way, Zarathustra is an invitation to some hard, but hopefully deeply human work.
That's what kind of one of the problems of Nietzsche, right? The fact that he's so hyperbolic, and so much, like you said, so much of the inspiration in his work in most other philosophy might be lost because of caveats and qualifiers. But instead, Nietzsche will say very provocative things that could be interpreted differently. But you have to sort of understand it as a contrast to the greater body of work to sort of know maybe what he was getting at. But you said that you could go into some of the specific metaphors of Zarathustra. I think that would be very, very applicable, because the context of Nietzsche's life as he wrote that book is so worthwhile. I think you're asking the question, how much of philosophy should be autobiographical? I think in this book particularly, it's extremely autobiographical, because he's sort of painting the person that he wishes he could be. He sort of knows deep down that he could aspire to be, but in his life around him, in his waking hours, he's not living out that life. He's sickly, he's depressed, women don't like him, his books aren't selling. So I think it would be really great to go into some of the specific metaphors of Zarathustra.
One of the interesting things is the choice of the name. So thus spoke Zarathustra. So who is Zarathustra? It's not it's not Bob, and it's not Dave or Jose. It's not like a common name. It's an extraordinarily unusual name. So right off the bat, you have to do some work to figure out who this guy is. And then we don't know a huge amount about the original Zoroaster. So, an early religious figure. I'm not even sure what his dates are. Maybe 2,800 years ago, maybe as long as 3,000 years ago, in what is now Iran,
Mesopotamia or something.
Now even a little further east than that.
Okay.
I think he was Persian, or he came out of the people who we now think of as the Persians, and a kind of religious prophet who had standard religious training, but then also had a kind of experience when he was older, around 30 years old perhaps, and a new vision of what proper religion / philosophy quest in life should be. Had a certain amount of charisma, and so attracted a following, including some people who were quite high up. And so Nietzsche is choosing this guy in part because some of the themes are that he is more of a kind of a prophet figure, not in the sense of there just being a whole bunch of gods and goddesses out there, but seeking a more unifying principle and a more systematic, worked out understanding of the place of human beings in the cosmos. But again, we don't know a huge amount. One of the interesting things about Zoroaster, though, is the extent to which the Abrahamic religions, further to the west, so by which we mean Hebrew, and then the breakaway version that is Christianity, and then the later breakaway version that is Islam, that many of the core themes that you find in those three religions are already anticipated by Zoroaster or Zarathustra. And then, an interesting question is to the extent to which those religions are independently founded, or whether they are borrowing heavily from yet earlier religious traditions, such as Zoroastrianism. So that's one interesting theme. So there's something about Zoroaster and his journey and his way of doing religion and philosophy that Nietzsche is picking up on and wanting to revive for contemporary times. It's also clear that Nietzsche has read all of the major Greeks, and you see reflections on those, often in allegorical form or metaphorical form. But also, there's a later work that Nietzsche calls the Antichrist, and that's and anticipated significantly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So you can see that the same literary form that Hebrew scriptures and then the New Testament are written in, being echoed, in some cases played with, in some cases turned on their heads, or mirror image, all of the literary things that people are doing. So Zoroaster is, to a large extent, meant to be, Zarathustra, Nietzsche's version of Zarathustra, is meant to be put in direct contrast to someone like Jesus, who went on his own journey and interacted with people of various sorts, and there are lessons, and he spoke in parables, and we need to interpret the parables, and out of that you can get something more systematic if that's how you are inclined. So one way then of reading this then is to just read the book and ask yourself, to what extent is Zoroaster or Zarathustra meant to be a counter to Jesus in terms of all of the major doctrines of the Judeo-Christian tradition? And remember that for
morality,
a lot of it's going to be focused on morality for sure, but for Nietzsche, Christianity is really just a purified form of Judaism. So can we extract, to the extent that we're analytic in this way, and say Christianity stands for these top 12 points, and we list them? Can we find then the counter to all 12 of those points represented in Zarathustra? And we do know shortly after Zarathustra, Nietzsche returns to writing a little more systematically, writing Beyond Good and Evil, and then Genealogy of Morals, which is explicitly an essay format. And there, clearly he is hammer and tongs going after the Judeo-Christian tradition, and kind of saying, if you didn't get the parable version in Zarathustra, I'm going to lay it out for you
explicitly.
Yes, for sure. So that's an interesting point there. And then I think at some point, given the short amount of time that we have here, given that we're not doing a course on this, maybe the best way to do it would be just to pick a few favorite aphorisms or a few favorite parables from it and speak to those.
Okay, sure. Could I tee you up then to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Unless you have some specific on hand that you want to really.
Well, I do have my favorites, but this is your show, so why don't you?
No, please.
Why don't you start us off?
Please deliver your favorites, and then I'd love to just tee you up for one specific that I'd love to hear you answer.
Sure. Well, one hobby horse of mine. I might as well put a plug in for my book, right? Nietzsche and the Nazis. Mm-hmm. The angle is a little bit different there, but I do spend a lot of time talking about Nietzsche. Mm-hmm.
Really?
And
that's half the title.
Well, yeah, that's right. And then I have another major journal article. It's almost a mini book itself, called "Egoism in Nietzsche and Rand." And in that one, it's a scholarly piece published in Journal of Ayn Rand Studies. I take up this issue in which, because often Nietzsche and Rand are conflated or they're seen as being working the same territory. So I focus on their views on altruism and egoism, both of which are central to their moral theories, and contrast them. The differences between the two are much more important than the smaller number of similarities between the two. But one of the things that I think is important to me as a philosopher is Nietzsche's reputation for being an individualist. Mm. And I think my view is that that's a superficial reading of Nietzsche, that Nietzsche is much more of a collectivist, than he is an individualist. So we take the concept of the overman that is introduced in Zarathustra. So God is dead, also introduced in Zarathustra. And so God was conceived of as the great creator and the great lawgiver, and human beings are in a subordinate status. We're supposed to receive and obey and act according to this great puppet master in the sky, right, and all of that sort of stuff. So with the death of God, Nietzsche then is saying that really God was just a projection by human beings of our potential that we have. So we created God, and in God we put all of our aspirations for what is possible. So what we need to do, in effect, is reclaim that creative power and see that we really are the creators of ourselves, of our lives, and we then need to be creators of new values. But quite early in the first part, in introducing the concept of the death of God, and then pointing toward the overman, what Nietzsche quite explicitly says is we human beings right now, the human being, or in the older translations, man or mankind, he's talking about the species, is a way station on this evolutionary path. And so what he's quite explicitly saying is you as an individual are not that important. What is important is you and your contribution to the development of the overman. So, and then he makes this very explicit evolutionary comparison. And of course, this is the early 1880s now as he's composing this. So it's 23 or 24 years after the publication of Origin of Species by Darwin. So this evolutionary matter. So what he wants to argue, though, is, what he says is, human beings in relation to the overman will be what now the ape is to human beings. So with all of these aspirations to be your best, to become creative and so on, it's not that you are an end in yourself. Your value is going to be to the extent that you contribute toward the creation of the overman, which is going to be a new species that exists at a higher level. So just as the ape, this is not very good evolutionary theory, but the ape has evolved into human beings will evolve into the overman. And so that's the end.
Mm-hmm.
And he's full of praise for people who will sacrifice themselves, who will bear all sorts of privations, and even be willing to die for this cause.
Yeah.
And the cause is not the old traditional, die for the king or die for your gods. It's not even, die for your family. It's die, right, or be sacrificed for the sake of this further species. So that very rich metaphor of evolution from ape to human to overman, I take that one very seriously, and he comes back to it over and over again. So those of you who are attracted to Nietzsche, right, because of the individualistic themes, and there are some in Nietzsche. He's very inspirational
Undoubtedly,
if you take him that way. But that's not the best philosophical reading of Nietzsche. Let me see if I can call it up. Oh, actually, this is just in the prologue section number 4. So I'll read a line.
Yeah, go for it.
What is great about human beings is that they are a bridge and not a purpose.
That's amazing. Yeah. Literally
right.
defining the evolution to the overman. Yeah.
That's right. So human beings are not the purpose. And here he's talking about the species as a whole. And you as an individual, you are not the purpose. Right? You are a bridge. Right? And we know it's either bridges are something that is a stage along the way, a crossing over to something else. So the purpose is somewhere beyond. So I would tee that one up for special attention and read everything else that comes up in Nietzsche in the light of that one.
Nice. That's amazing. I've never heard that interpretation of it before, but it does add so much flavor to the unbelievable ambition that he has, because like we'll foreshadow for later, he tries to usurp the morality of the Bible, right? But then again, you have here, he's actually trying to evolve the species. I mean, that right. is, so there's at least
the important thing there is, rather than sacrificing yourself for these mythic, otherworldly beings
who you've never met, never spoken to, exactly. Yeah.
And let me just read one more from that same section. I love those who do not first seek behind the stars for a reason to go. Behind the stars for a reason to go under. So behind the stars, the gods or God, right, is out there. So why should I go under? A metaphor for sacrifice. I'm looking for some reason behind the stars, and be a sacrifice, who instead sacrifice themselves for the earth, so that the earth one day may become the overman's. So he's not opposed to sacrificing individuals, and he does want you to sacrifice yourself, but not for the gods, but for the future overman, whoever those beings might be.
Wow.
So, and then one more section from this, where he is a different metaphor here, that we're like a raindrop in a storm cloud, waiting for the lightning to come along.
Yeah.
So you're just a raindrop.
Yeah,
right? And how important is the raindrop?
Inconsequential, exactly.
That's right. And the raindrop is going to fall and splatter itself on the earth. I love all those who are like heavy drops, falling individually from the dark cloud that hangs over humanity. They herald the coming of lightning, and as heralds, they perish. So your job is, you will perish. Yeah. But your job in your perishing is that you are part of this mass, right, that is going to signal or herald the coming of the lightning. And it's really the lightning that we are waiting for.
And that
the lightning is
going the to value be, you derive rather than...
That's right. And that will be the overman, right, or some sort of Zeus-like being who has the capacity to make things happen. So
beautiful.
That one, that I think is important. Now, I've published on this, and I do get a lot of grief on this.
Okay.
Because there are a lot of people are very wedded to Nietzsche being an arch individualist and individualist all the way down and so forth. But I caution against that interpretation.
Nice. And that's you teasing out in comparison to Rand, the individualist side of things. You're saying they're not in fact synonymous. Right. Yeah.
Right. So I think Rand is properly interpreted as an individualist, and Nietzsche, with some qualifications, is not actually much of an individualist.
Amazing.
Philosopher.
Before we move on from Zarathustra, I would love to just hear you comment on the large metaphor of it all, which you already have in other words, but just again to like nail the just to double down completely, to speak more about the metaphor of becoming who you are, because you've mentioned the hero's journey several times, which is obviously the work of
Yeah.
Joseph Campbell, who built that off the work of Carl Jung, who built that immediately after the death of Nietzsche. Carl Jung came exactly after him and ended up at the point of individuation. Carl Jung's idea was this is the ultimate purpose of any person. If they can, in Nietzsche's idea, become an Übermensch, Carl Jung's idea is that they become individuated, they become themselves, they fulfill all of their potential and more, without an end goal necessarily, just knowing that the entire journey is the value of it. With that as the context, you know, tying in Jung's individuation, you've mentioned the hero's journey. Can you speak more about Nietzsche's metaphor that he really wants to hammer home here on a person becoming who they are, fulfilling whatever their potential might be, irrespective, and that's obviously a little bit separate probably from what you've just said about them being a bridge to an evolution of the species. If we don't include that, what do you think?
Yeah, the who you are is a potentiality, and Nietzsche's view is that he's not the overman, and he doesn't think any of us really are the overman. Some of us, perhaps 1 in 10 million will have some serious potential to shake things up and do some sort of creating new value. So this language of being a herald of some future development, and evolution works in long time. I think he does take that seriously. So largely what he is doing is, after you set aside the 99% of the population whom he thinks are sheep, but kind of even worse because they are human beings who failed to live up even to a minimal human level and have declined to the level of sheep. And then you have the 1% of us who have some creative potential and actually are willing to go out and do something amazing. And then out of that 1,999,000 will fail significantly, but at least they tried. And then there will be that tiny sliver of humanity that does something significant that takes the human being a little bit further down the path to the overman. So what I think Nietzsche is doing is trying to be inspirational to that part in us, those of us who have something in us that is some potential worth developing. And without being at all programmatic about what form or even what direction that will take, whether it will happen in the entrepreneurial business sector, whether it will be in the scientific sector or in the artistic sector or the music sector, or just becoming a great explorer of the earth and the universe sector. He doesn't want to say what that's going to be. It's just going to be something that you will do. And I like also his metaphor of the three stages, the three metamorphoses, which I think is also very rich about becoming who you are. Here he's a little bit programmatic about it. So he says, we go through 3 stages, as long as we're willing to go on this journey, like a camel stage, a lion stage, and then the final stage is becoming a child again. And that latter is, to go back to our first point, kind of interestingly in parallel to the born again theme, right? That's in Christianity, that after going through a certain process, one can be born again. And you find that picked up in Nietzsche, this third stage of being a child. So let's just say for human beings who are willing to take on the great project, the first stage is this camel stage. And so we imagine a camel is going to go off on a long desert journey into a kind of a wilderness where everything is barren. And in order to prepare for that journey, what you need to do, like a camel does, is drink a lot of water. So you soak it up. And the parallel here might be, I'm just going to use the word might be, to young people who, preparing for their life, they become alive intellectually and open to the broad world. And you become a kind of sponge, right? You're just hungry and open to all sorts of new experiences. and you have this great thirst for knowledge. So you read everything that you can, and you just take it in to try to fill yourself up. And it also can, again, might be interpreted as that kind of alienated teen stage, precocious teenager stage, where you feel like you're in a desert landscape, socially, culturally, and so forth. You are alienated and so on. So the camel, you soak everything up, but also you want to test yourself. You want to take on challenges. And so the camel gets loaded with very heavy burdens, and it's very impressive how much a camel can take. So you'll take on great challenges and great responsibilities, and then go out and see what you can do. All right, so that's a very rich metaphor, and I'm not going to be too programmatic about it, but Nietzsche puts it out there, and he has his own description. So start with that one. But then he says the next stage is the lion stage. And the lion stage is where you become a fighter. So the camel is, in one sense, passive, just absorbing stuff from the environment, reacting to what it sees as a kind of desert environment that it's alienated to. But it's also accepting burdens, and it's allowing lots of burdens to be placed on it. But most of the time, the burdens that are put on the camel are put on by the camel's owner. Someone else is making decisions what those burdens should be. That the lion stage is when you have realized the fullness of your strength and your aspiration not to be bearing burdens and doing things because other people said you were supposed to bear these burdens and do these responsibilities. So you become a fighter, you become a predator. You go out and you attack, and you want to tear down and destroy any potential enemies, partly to assert your own strength, but then also to signal to yourself and to everybody else that you are not a beast of burden, right, any longer. Now, to some extent, this is still reactive to the world. Other people are putting these burdens upon me, and I need to be adversarial and attacking with respect to other people. But then the third stage, Nietzsche then says, once you've got that out of your system, as you become a child again. And you're then able to approach the world the way a child approaches it, with innocence and with wonder, and this the sense of I can go out and do whatever it is that I want. And Nietzsche leaves it there. So yes, we need to go through these various stages. Yes, we need to test ourselves in various ways. Yes, we need to be reactive against the world, but that should not be defining you and ultimately be where you end up. And a lot of people, depending on the limits of their strength, they get stuck at those various stages, or they get crushed by those various stages. That ultimately one should strive again to be a child. And I think all of us can remember, no matter how bitter or jaded or tired we are now, in middle age or near middle age or wherever we are right now, to remember what it was like to be a child at the best, that sense of openness and benevolence and sunlit skies, and to be able to go forth and do what you want in the world. Now, Nietzsche leaves it at that point. He doesn't then say the child then needs to be trained in this particular way and in this particular direction. He just wants us to find again that childlike state of doing life, but as an adult. So I think that one's very important. Now, another one, before we make a transition here, is Nietzsche steering away from anything that's too programmatic is the point at which Zarathustra has attracted a certain number of followers and people who are listening to him. But he then says, the great danger here is the danger that all disciples have. And again, there's going to be a parable to Jesus, once Jesus has attracted his followers and so on, where disciples become subordinate. They're willing to hang on every word the master says, and to take the words of the master and the master's way of dressing and the master's way of behaving in the world, and just to copy that. And so they become emulators. And Nietzsche said that's a great danger. And I do not want people to follow me in that sense. And so he goes out of his way to say, and this is another favorite line that you will see often quoted, is that one repays a teacher badly if one always remains a student. So yes, you are under someone else's tutelage for a while, but your goal is not just to be a disciple of the master. And so he explicitly urges all of his disciples to say, go away from me now. You've absorbed some things from me. Go away. Don't be a follower of me anymore. In fact, what I want you to do is be suspicious of me.
Sure.
Maybe everything I have told you is nonsense.
You can never become
challenge me.
who you are in the shadow of somebody else.
Exactly, that's right. So go off and follow. So in a way, that's an anti-Jesus point to the extent that Christianity is interpreted as you are a follower and you are always going to be subordinate, and so on. So I, as your teacher, I can help prepare you, but only you can find your own voice, find your own way, find your own passions, find your own strengths. And then you have to break away with me or from me and go off and do it, whatever that is.
If you can, try keep this to a minute or two. But as you were describing those stages, I was just thinking, is there something instinctual to what he's saying here? Is there anything, is it like almost an inherent mode of being to go through those stages, or at least long for those stages? Or without someone imposing them on us, would they just be missed? Does that question make sense? Like, what is Nietzsche tapping into some sort of instinct here, or is it totally separated from that?
Well, I think here I want to jump ahead from Zarathustra. The way he speaks in Zarathustra, he's often, condemnatory of various sorts of people, but there is an overarching benevolence that even the people who don't listen to Zarathustra, who mock him, who don't recognize him for what he is, kind of the misunderstood prophet trope. Zarathustra's reaction often is this, well, they're just not ready for me yet. So he's not then entirely dismissive of them to say, these people are scum, it's hopeless, et cetera, et cetera. There's this idea that he's a prophet, and there's some people are ready to listen to him, but the rest of the population is not ready to listen yet. And that leaves open the possibility that still they're on their evolutionary path, and maybe just the instincts are a little more muted in them, or slower in development in them, and so on. In his later works, though, I think he does become much more condemnatory. And my reading of the later Nietzsche is that he does think that it is largely biological, to use this instinct language, and the vast majority of people just don't have what it takes. And it's only a tiny percentage of the human population that has the right kinds of instincts, and those instincts are fiery enough to go out and do something.
And that type of language is obviously rife to be manipulated with, which obviously it does after his death. Like the notion that there is, a genetic or biological difference between the potential of certain people, and that metaphor should be clear to anybody listening. Look,
right. So by the time we get shortly thereafter into Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy of Morals, his tone is much harsher.
Well, look.
So there are predators and prey, and that is within human beings as well.
We've totally blown the timer, but that's okay. I think it's better to embellish a question rather than sort of rush it just for the sake of a time limit. But
we're going to spend the whole time just on Zarathustra.
Well, let's see if we can transition it. I was thinking.
Okay, go ahead then.
Because you've now teed up his future work, I think, well enough that we can then introduce it. And the metaphor of thus spoke Zarathustra hopefully is understood. So it seems Nietzsche has propelled himself onto a role. After he gets this book out, thus spoke Zarathustra, he returns to the road and also turns in another Western canon classic, Beyond Good and Evil, and also the Genealogy of Morality, which is an ever-present testament to the random tastes of publishers, because neither of them are successful. They're self-published. No one thought they were good. They're just trash. Nietzsche here tirades against what he thought was pathetic and despicable. At the top of the list, worship and religion. I just want to give you some space to decompress these two books. Obviously, slave morality is a
Mm,
big part of this as well. On to you.
mm. Well, yes. These books do become increasingly uh, didactic after Zarathustra. So Zarathustra is a literary and philosophical masterpiece. That's not to downgrade at all the accomplishments of Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy of Morals, but they are written in a much more accessible style. That is to say, there are literary elements and parables and
Hmm.
so on, but you don't have as much literary work unpacking them. So Beyond Good and Evil is quite hefty. It's long. I believe it's divided into about 9 different books, and each of them, in varying length, has a whole number of aphorisms. And there, the idea is that uh, once we have this idea that we have the potential to be more than we are, that we're not going to uh, be stuck in a kind of authoritarian life model, morally or even metaphysically. There are some more powerful being or beings that made us, that own us, that tell us what to do, that are watching what we are doing, and we have to follow along. So we're able to break all of that and then go off and find our true humanity as creative human beings. Uh, why are so many people not willing to do that or able to do that? And so here we find Nietzsche also exploring not only the history of religion and the history of morality, but also getting much more deeply into psychology and biology. So the theme Beyond Good and Evil is meant to give a typology of morals. To say that if we look then at the history of human beings thinking about philosophy and the good life and the bad life and what the meaning of life is, we have this one kind of moral code that centers around the concepts of good and evil. And here the idea is that there is a source of good, and that good is pure and absolute, and it might be otherworldly. It usually is in the religious forms, and that everything is a falling away from that, and the opposite of that, and that is evil. And what's interesting about the concept of evil is that it's a knowing rejection of the good. So it's not just that, I don't know, you have you, you're having a picnic and some raccoon comes along and snatches your sandwich, right? And you would say bad raccoon, but the raccoon is not evil, right? Because the
Doesn't
raccoon
know any better.
is just doing, yeah, it doesn't know any better. And so this Beyond Good and Evil is an upgrade to that. The idea that we human beings know that we're supposed to be obedient and following these commands and so forth, but we are in rebellion against these commands. And so we are doing bad things, but we're knowingly doing those bad things. And so therefore we are evil. And then on the basis of that, to the extent that we um, try to conceptualize and rationalize our willingness to do evil, we just become more and more evil, and we get further and further away from God. And then the most extreme versions of that are the strong forms of original sin that say human beings are just thoroughly corrupt and thoroughly evil all of the way through. And so we have this very polarized notion: human beings and everything that they do by themselves is evil, and God is at the other end of the spectrum, and everything that God is entirely pure and good. So what Nietzsche wants to do is explode that notion. We have to get beyond entirely that way of thinking about morality. Now, what he then wants to do is not then to say that therefore there is no such thing as good and there is no such thing as bad. It's that they have been misconceptualized by a certain sort of person. And so this is partly where we get into the psychological and the biological territory. And what Nietzsche does with his genealogical perspective, and the fact that he's studied so many cultures, modern and ancient and so on, is realize how many different moral codes there are out there. So this idea that there is one understanding of good and bad, and we all kind of know what that is, Nietzsche does not think that that's true. Just as a historical fact, what is prized as good in some cultures is the exact opposite of what is prized as good in various other cultures. And this includes, killing and lying and how many wives you're allowed to take, right, and so forth. There is no such thing as the good that we all recognize, and that some of us just are in rebellion from. We have these dramatically different understandings of what good and the bad are. So this Judeo-Christian approach that has a kind of monopoly on Western culture, even in slightly more secularized forms, among which he would name the socialists and most people who are in favor of democracy, but that's a sidebar for later. That entire approach is not, in fact, a historical monopoly, but rather just one version of morality that, for various reasons, has come to dominate Western culture. And so, partly his training as a philologist, that is, a studier of language, and an expert in language, gives him a lot of clues toward this. So he goes back into various ancient languages and says, they're pro words or success words or positive words, and all of the traits that they are prizing, strength and assertiveness and pride and dignity
Courage.
and so on. Yeah, that's right. All of these are the things that are good for them, and all of the things that are bad in that moral vocabulary, like humble or being humble and patient and obsequious and obedient and so
Forgiving.
on. From that perspective, right, all of those traits are quite negative. And so the point is, historically, there have been lots of moral cultures that have praised as good the very things that the Jews and the Christians have come to see as bad and therefore labeled as evil. So Nietzsche's question then is, how is it that this, and he calls it at various points, this more aristocratic moral code, where you are praising hierarchy and strength and assertiveness and the willingness to engage in the martial arts and to conquer and to enjoy your riches, and in some cases, of course, to think of yourself as metaphorically God's gift to humankind, and everybody else is dirt beneath your feet. If that has been widespread in human history in so many different cultures around the world, in the ancient Arabs, in the ancient samurai, in the Homeric heroes, and so forth, how on earth could this moral code that praises humility and washing the feet of beggars and saying I'm so unworthy, and this willingness to lower yourself and prostrate yourself on the ground and press your forehead to the dirt, and be ashamed of your body and feel guilty whenever you want to have sex and so on. How on earth could a moral code like that, it's so pathetic, have any sort of attraction, not only some sort of attraction, but come to be the dominant moral code in Western civilization? So that's his great question. He calls that the inversion of morality. So this old master aristocratic knightly code of morality, in contrast to what he then calls a moral code fit for slaves, who have to be humble and obedient and so forth. How is it that this inversion has occurred? And you see him playing around, sometimes with cultural explanations, sometimes with psychological explanations, and sometimes with biological explanations. So, if we take a biological explanation, it could just be that we look out in other animal species, and we see some animal species are hawks and lions and wolves and they're natural
Some
predators,
animals'
and
only
so.
purpose is to be fodder for other animals.
And that's right. And other animals are squirrels and rabbits and chipmunks. And that's just the way they are biologically. And so built into nature is this strong versus weak dynamic. And this predatory ethic is going to be natural for the predators. And this kind of more fearful and stay in the herd. And I hope that the big dangerous beings leave me
Safety in numbers
alone.
types.
yeah, that's right. It's going to be now. Now, what happens then if we just transpose that into human beings and then say biologically, some human beings are more like predators and some are
Hmm.
like herd animals, right?
Yeah.
Or bunny rabbits,
And
right?
as a metaphor, it's
Uh,
very seductive to think about. But then once it is taken literally, is where the problems start to arise. Eh?
Well, of course. Well, yeah, that's exactly right. So, but then sometimes he's playing around with more psychological explanation. It's not necessarily biological, but that is just perhaps all human beings have a certain potential to live up to a certain standard of what it is to be a good human being. Just like, say, all baby lion cubs or young lions have a potential as lions to aspire to some level of dignity and majesty as lions. Not all of them are going to be the alphas, but nonetheless, all of them can be a pretty healthy and admirable specimen of what it is to be a lion. So maybe all human beings have this, but then the question is going to be why some fail to do so. And here you'll find Nietzsche using his moralistic language, where he say, really, it's a failure of courage. You have the potential there, but you're a little bit afraid, and you let that fear dominate you, and you shouldn't. And so, and many times, you'll see this in Zarathustra, but it gets fleshed out more in Beyond Good and Evil. It's people failing to live up to the power and potential that they have, and it is a moral failing on their part. And the one that he most often signals is a kind of cowardice. So I know, right, that I can go out and seek women, right, and I really want to go out and seek women. And as a male, my biological urge is to go out and relate to women a certain way, but then I'm afraid, right? What if she says no, right? What if her friends laugh at me and I let that dominate in me? Well, that's a betrayal on
Sure.
my part, right? Or I have this business idea and I could go out and start. I could quit this crummy job that I'm in, but I'm
Sure.
afraid, and so I don't do it. And so then I turn myself into a more corrupt being, and I kind of actually start to
Mhm.
hate myself because I know it's my failure to take the
Yeah.
risk, to take the plunge, to go out and pursue my dream. And so I'll pretend that, the world didn't give me a chance, and all the rich capitalists held me back, but I really know that
Yeah.
that is a fault of mine. So he plays around a lot with those with those psychological explanations as well. And then one other big explanation that he puts out is a kind of a historical and cultural conditioning explanation that so he will point out in the case of Jews, for example. So if you actually go back into the history of the Jews, they were one of many tribes kicking around in Middle Eastern basin.
In ancient
Sorry.
Egypt, right?
Yeah, that's right. And then they ended up becoming slaves under the Egyptians. And then the question is going to be, given that historical circumstance, how do you survive as a slave under more power? How do you keep your cultural identity and your cultural traditions together? And so what he argues here is, the Jews were biologically and psychologically just like human beings anywhere are, but they were smart about reacting to their
Hmm.
existential situation of being slaves and realized, well, if I try to act as a human being as a slave, I'm just going to get killed. And so what I need to do is inculcate patience. And if the master strikes me and beats me, well, I have to kind of
Hmm.
shrug
Hmm.
it off and forgive and be humble and be silent and be willing to wait for a
Hmm.
long time and to be obedient and so on. So those become
Yeah.
survival values in that particular historical context. But then you teach your children those survival values because you want them to grow up, and then it just becomes more conditioned
Yeah.
cultural values
Because a
over
slave who
time.
stands
So
up to his master will not get a chance to reproduce
yeah,
himself into the next line.
yeah,
And
exactly
the
right.
yeah. Then on the
Absolutely
other
right.
side of the
Exactly
coin as
right.
well, the master who is weak in answering whatever call to adventure that is required will also fail to sort of reproduce his line, and so they sort of converge out separate
Hmm.
paths. And there's that.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicely put. So in Beyond Good and Evil, and then more systematically in the three essays of Genealogy of Morals, you see Nietzsche working out these lines. And what I think, my reading of Nietzsche is that ultimately it's the biological explanation that is going to be the deepest with him. That's the one that he returns to the most, particularly in his later works.
That also, that explanation you just gave of slave morality, in other words, I urged people to do in the last podcast, but I'll do it again. In your Open College podcast, the episode on slave morality is terrific. You know, it really does, I think, at least for myself,
Thanks.
you know, really help me understand what he meant by this, because, you know, there's so many ways to interpret such a like kind of ambiguous metaphor, and as you've just fleshed out.
Yeah.
Uh,
Right. So we have this slave morality that's, praising forgiveness and mercy and meekness and the meek will inherit the earth, which is basically saying just be meek and somebody's going to deliver the goods to you at some point in the distant future, right? And be afraid of the big bad world. That morality, he thinks, is just an expression of a certain psychological type. That some people are just meek and by nature and afraid of the big bad world, and so it's a subjective codification or expression of a certain psychological type. But then ultimately, he wants to say even that psychological type is just an expression of a biological state of being. That some people just they don't have what it takes. So the mind is an expression of underlying physical things that they have conflicting and weak drives and so on. And so ultimately, he reduces it to biological imperative.
And how did Nietzsche explain how slave morality managed to conquer over master morality in as to become the dominant morality of Western civilization, according to Nietzsche, obviously?
Yeah, that's a really hard question in Nietzsche, and I think Nietzsche is still scratching his head about that. Because from his perspective, if you go back to the ancient world, you have the Greeks who are magnificent, and he admired, right, the Greeks, and then the Greeks are conquered by the Romans, but a lot of Greek culture is absorbed into the Romans, and so you've got this great master culture, the Romans, and the Romans are basically awesome at everything.
He loved them.
And so on. Yeah, for sure. Right. So, and they are the dominant power in the Middle East, and in the Middle East at that time, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of little religions kicking around, and the Romans are totally dominating them. They could wipe out any of them that they want, and to some extent, the Romans, they did their persecutions, but they're by and large tolerant. Just revere our gods and do what we tell you, follow the law, and you can have your own silly little gods, and we're fine with that as well. So how could this, to put it bluntly, this obscure, somewhat pathetic, semi-organized desert dwellers, a lot of them pretty illiterate, with this rather meek moral code, how could they prevail over the Romans? And how could they then not only prevail over the Romans, but then sweep all of Europe and then become the dominant moral code in the world? And I don't think Nietzsche has a good explanation for that. By the time we get into Genealogy of Morals, he's still diagnosing the historical decline. So he presents a kind of historical saga. So Rome is great, but then Rome declines. The emperor converts to Christianity, and then following that, the upper classes largely convert to Christianity, and Christianity becomes the dominant religion. But then it continues to decline. We get into kind of the Dark Ages, another controversial topic, but things really were dark for about 5 centuries in Europe. But then we start to get some resurgences of master morality in the Renaissance. And then we have the Reformation as a reaction, right, against that. But then we do start to see figures like Frederick the Great, and then Napoleon, and so on rising up. So a resurgence of master morality. But even so, by the time we get to the 19th century in Europe, where Nietzsche is reflecting on the culture, he sees the people who have the master morality potential in them as still a tiny minority, surrounded by this field of mediocrity. So even people, there's a huge religious revival that goes on in Germany in the early part of the 1800s. So people rejecting modernity and not liking all the new science and industry and the whole, of course, of the modern world, and be a free agent and go off and seek your own artistic and world adventures. Huge swaths of people saying, no, we don't want any of that. We want to go back into our synagogues and go back into our churches and have the priests and the ministers tell us what to do. Right? So why on earth is this going on? You have this increasingly rich and free society, but most people don't want it. They want their safe little religion. They want their safe little house where they can be comfortable and have their tea at the end of the day or whatever. They don't want the great adventure. Why the hell is this happening even in the 1900s? Even those who are willing to break away from their traditional religious model and to become secular and to become naturalistic, Nietzsche is aghast that a huge number of them turn to socialism. Right? From his perspective, this idea everybody is equal and we all need to work together, right? And we don't like those rich people who've got so much. Well, that's just smacks of envy and herd morality, right? And so on. And instead of the God and the church looking after you, they just want the government to look after them. Just give me my nice little welfare check, and I'm going to stay in my herd. And that's the great socialist ideal. How pathetic is that? Right? Nietzsche is saying. And even in other political expressions, the idea that we should be democratic, that we should say everybody should be able to run for political office, and everybody should be able to vote on all of these complicated and weighty matters.
The same merit.
Yeah, that's right. Everybody's vote is equal, right? And everybody's voice should be heard. When it's obvious, particularly from Nietzsche's perspective, that most people are idiots, most people are clueless. Right, and most people are just mirrors for other people's opinions about various sorts of things and so on. So he sees the 19th century as dominated by religious revival, by socialism, by democracy, and it's still a big mystery, I think, to him why this is the case. So I think he's increasingly at that point saying, yeah, a lot of people are culturally conditioned to believe those sorts of things. But then the question still for him is going to be, why would this cultural conditioning work? Right? Because you take a baby wolf, and you can't train a baby wolf to become a house pet. Right? The wolf is still there. If there is some sort of being that you can, through cultural conditioning, train to be a house pet, well, that's something that was basically just fit for being a house pet in the first place. So I think he's at that point not fully satisfied with this explanation, but I think he wants to say somehow the slave types, the people who are attracted to religion, attracted to socialism, attracted to democracy, they have just outbred, and this is the biological language coming for the vast majority of people, and then the evolutionary lines that occasionally pop up with someone with their act together and great instinctual energy and vigor and the chutzpah to go out and do something is they're just a minority genetically, although the genetics language we can't quite use that yet. That's still a bit anachronistic for Nietzsche's time.
We've done an hour and 5 minutes, which means I'm afraid that I've probably exhausted all your time. That we pick up with a part 3 where we can do will to power and then how Nietzsche's been interpreted after his death.
Good and evil. Maybe we can turn to the last phase of Nietzsche's life.
Yeah, what we have to be excited for is obviously the will to power and all of the implications of that, whether it is, the work of a madman or whether it was still written when he was lucid, and then obviously how he's been interpreted since his death. And then finally, something I would love to hear you comment on is, what would he think of modernity, basically? Is it the hell that he thought would be the
Mm.
consequence of the death of God? So a lot of interesting
There
stuff.
we
And I
go.
have a
Yeah.
question that I really want to ask you, but it deserves time. So I won't ask it now. So with that, Stephen, thank you so much again for giving me your time. I'm very grateful to receive it.
A real pleasure, Ryan. All right. And we'll see you in a few months.
Well, that was tremendously exciting. I need to thank Stephen Hicks again for coming on and doing this with me. Nietzsche is such a fascinating character for all of the reasons which I hope are becoming obvious to you. Episode 3 will probably be recorded sometime early next summer. The reason why there's so much time between them is just because Hicks has a lot of things to do. So he's going to teach his summer course, and then we're going to schedule a time and hopefully publish what will finally be the 3rd hour, which will then be able to be repurposed for a long episode later that can sit on YouTube and the podcast algorithms and hopefully get to work introducing people to Friedrich Nietzsche. But thank you. If you've listened this far in, I assume that that podcast wasn't terrible. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the fact that I still have your attention. And I just want to quickly explain what my ambition is for this podcast, because obviously it is a hobby and an interest of mine, but I also do want to make it a little bit more than that. I want to corner the podcast market for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is that you're listening in from. Now, I don't know specifically what genre that falls into, and I don't know specifically what type of demographic listener might be interested in that, but nonetheless, that's what I'm aiming for. Obviously, the episodes are different all the time. There's different types of guests, different levels of professionalism, and maybe different levels of seriousness. But each time, my goal is, well, I don't necessarily have a goal going into it, but each time my thoughts are similar. I'm trying to expand upon my worldview by absorbing someone else's. And the great thing about podcasting is that you can absorb other people's worldviews all the time. It's unbelievable. I'm a podcast maximalist, if there's such a thing. Ever since 2014, when I first heard of this Joe Rogan guy and then got further deep into it, I'm surely at the tail end distribution of hours spent listening to podcasts in the last 5-6 years. Absolutely love them. I think they're the most amazing piece of media available, because if you find the right podcast who has the right guest, Jesus Christ, it can be a seriously good learning tool. And also it can just satisfy your interests, and it can feed your curiosities. So I'm hoping to fit into that latter part. Obviously, I'm not presenting myself as some sort of expert on anything. I'm just another person on the internet who's decided to reach out to people and record interviews. So what I want to do with this podcast is just corner that market for eclectic curiosities. And who knows if there even is such a thing, but nonetheless, to get there, it means there needs to be reviews. So please, discoverability within all the podcast distributions are shite. They're completely stuck in the Stone Age. The one index that they look at really is the amount of reviews that's attached to it. So if you could leave a review, make it 5 stars, and leave a comment in the review as well. And hey, that would be the most amazing thing that you could do for me. I cannot overstate how helpful it would be. So again, if I still have your attention, then you're an absolute legend, and thank you so much for listening through to this stage. Don't be shy to reach out to me. You can find me on Twitter at Ryan F. Hogg, or just email me. You'll see on my website, very easy to email me. I'd love to hear from you. I've met up with a couple of people who just serendipitously stumbled across the website here in Stockholm. And if you could also be one of those, I would be thrilled, truly over the moon to connect with you. That's all. Cheers, Mr. Hicks, one more time, and ciao.